What if the woman you were forced to marry refused to show her face even on your wedding day? And what if, behind that veil, was someone who would outsmart your entire boardroom? Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The dining room of the expansive Rainridge estate shimmered under the soft amber glow of the chandelier above. The table, long enough to accommodate 20 guests, was set with polished silverware and porcelain dishes, though only 3 seats were filled. Damien Carter, 28, lounged at one end, appearing composed, though his clenched jaw betrayed his irritation. Across from him, his father sipped wine with measured elegance, while his mother observed him with folded hands and silent intensity. "This isn't happening," Damien said, cutting through the heavy silence. He nudged aside his untouched plate, the steak now cooled. "You can't be serious." "Damien," his father responded evenly, "this isn't up for debate. It's a resolution that's already been finalized." Damien leaned back, running a hand through his dark hair. "Finalized without my input? How generous of you." "Lose the sarcasm," his mother snapped. "This isn't just about you. It's about the family legacy, about protecting everything we've worked for." His green eyes narrowed. "And forcing me into a marriage with a stranger, that's your solution?" "You'll meet her soon," his father replied, calmly setting his glass down. "Brittany comes from a reputable lineage. This alliance is mutually beneficial." Damien scoffed. "Reputable? Then why does she hide under a veil? What's she covering up? Disfigurement? A scandalous past?" "Don't be cruel," his mother said icily. "Brittany is reserved. She has her reasons. She doesn't owe you a confession." "No, but apparently I owe her my entire future," Damien muttered. "Why me? Why not find someone else eager to play along?" "Because you're the face of this family," his father said firmly. "And the reins are integral to our enterprise. This union is a strategic partnership." Damien laughed without humor. "So it's a corporate merger disguised as a wedding. Perfect. Who needs love anyway?" "Stop being melodramatic," his mother said, her tone softening. "We're not asking you to love her, just to honor the commitment." His fists curled against the table. "My role is to marry someone I don't know? Sacrifice my own choices. You'll have everything you could ever want," his father replied smoothly. "And so will she." Damien stood suddenly, his chair scraping sharply against the hardwood. "I don't want this," he said, voice low, brimming with restrained anger. "I don't want her." "You'll meet her tomorrow," his mother said as she rose. Her voice was firm with finality. "At dinner. And I expect you to act like the man we raised you to be." Damien met her eyes, jaw tight. He said nothing more. Instead, he turned and walked out, the weight of their expectations pressing heavily on his shoulders. Upstairs, alone in his room, Damien poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the city lights of Seattle through the window. The burn of the alcohol did little to ease the rage simmering within. An arranged marriage to a woman who refused to show her face. It felt archaic, like some twisted relic of the past. He downed the drink in a single swallow. Tomorrow, he thought bitterly. Tomorrow, he'd finally see what game his parents and Brittany were playing. One thing was certain. He wasn't going to make this easy for anyone. The next evening, the Rains estate stirred with quiet energy as staff made final touches in preparation for the formal dinner. Damien entered his parents' formal sitting room, his expression neutral but his irritation palpable. His father gave him a curt nod, while his mother offered a faint smile. "She'll be here shortly," she said, smoothing out the folds of her gown. "Terrific," Damien muttered, adjusting his cufflinks. A moment later, the soft sound of footsteps on polished wood turned their heads. A woman entered, accompanied by an older man Damien recognized as Sterling Rains, the head of the Rains family. She walked with effortless poise, her posture elegant and serene. A long, gauzy veil covered her face, falling past her shoulders. Only her eyes were visible, stormy gray and sharply intelligent, the kind of eyes that made it hard to look away. "Damien," his mother said brightly, "this is Brittany." Brittany inclined her head politely. Her voice, calm and clear, carried just enough warmth to be disarming. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Damien." He hesitated, focusing on the veil. He extended his hand by reflex, but his thoughts were anything but calm. "Likewise," he replied, his voice low and guarded. The four of them gathered around the grand dining table. The air was stiff, conversations practiced. Damien found himself unable to focus on the words exchanged. His attention remained fixed on Brittany, on her veil, her composure, and the mystery wrapped around her presence like silk. Midway through the meal, he couldn't restrain himself any longer. He set down his fork and looked directly at her. "You don't have to wear that in here," he said, his voice steady but pointed. "No one's judging you." His mother flashed him a warning glare, but Brittany remained unaffected. Her eyes met his with eerie calm. "Thank you," she said, "but I prefer to keep it on." Damien arched an eyebrow. "Why? Are you hiding something?" "Damien!" his mother hissed under her breath, voice sharp with reproach. "It's all right," Brittany said gently. Her voice didn't waver. "I'm not concealing anything that should matter. What's behind the veil isn't relevant to this arrangement." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Arrangement? Interesting way to describe marriage." She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't that what this is? An agreement? Your parents need a merger, and so does mine. No point pretending otherwise." Her words stung, cutting through Damien's sarcasm and indignation with chilling precision. "So you're fine with that?" he asked, voice laced with cynicism. "No love? No connection? Just business?" Brittany didn't blink. "Do you think pretending changes the nature of what this is?" He opened his mouth to respond but found no retort. The confidence in her tone rattled him more than he expected. "I'd at least like to know who I'm marrying," he said after a pause. "Not your name or your resume, you." "You will," Brittany replied. "In time. For now, all you need to know is I understand what's expected of me. And I hope you understand what's expected of you." Her calm assurance caught him off guard. He flushed with frustration, but before he could speak, Sterling cleared his throat, shifting the mood. "Shall we move on to dessert?" he suggested diplomatically. The remainder of the dinner passed with careful, superficial conversation. Brittany remained as composed and unknowable as ever. When the night came to an end, Damien walked Brittany and Sterling to the front door. As she turned to leave, he couldn't stop himself. "Why do you act like this doesn't matter?" he asked, his voice quiet but pointed. Brittany paused. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe as she glanced back at him. "It matters," she said softly. "Just not in the way you expect." And with that, she stepped into the night, leaving Damien alone with more questions than answers. The wedding day arrived in a blur of extravagance and ceremonial splendor. The venue, a historic estate nestled just outside Seattle, was adorned with cascading florals, shimmering lights, and the faint hum of a string quartet tuning up for the reception. Damien stood at the altar, rigid in posture, a storm of resentment brewing beneath the surface. Around him, guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns whispered beneath their breath. When Brittany appeared at the end of the aisle, the room fell silent. She was draped in a stunning ivory gown, her entire face still hidden behind a flowing veil. Her every step was measured, graceful, yet that fabric barrier remained impenetrable and provocative. Damien's jaw clenched as she approached. He could feel dozens of eyes watching, judging, speculating. "She still won't take it off," someone whispered behind him. "Maybe there's a reason," came the murmured reply. The ceremony unfolded with all the pomp expected of a union between two influential families. Vows were exchanged, rings placed. Then came the officiant's warm prompt, "You may kiss the bride." Damien hesitated, his gaze flicking to Brittany. She made no move to lift the veil. With a resigned breath, he placed a restrained kiss against the veil's fabric, the gesture hollow and ceremonial. Polite applause rippled through the room, but tension lingered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. The reception was held in a grand ballroom, filled with champagne flutes, live music, and elegant chandeliers. And yet, despite the dazzling surroundings, the atmosphere between Damien and Brittany remained distant. They sat side by side at the head table, barely speaking. Damien sipped his drink, eyes scanning the crowd. Snippets of whispered speculation floated to his ears. Why wouldn't she take the veil off? Maybe she's not who they say she is. Poor guy. Must be hard marrying a mystery. Damien's grip on his glass tightened, his frustration simmering. He glanced at Brittany, who sat with perfect composure, her face still hidden. If the whispers bothered her, she gave no sign. Later that evening, they were escorted to the private suite prepared for them. The silence between them was deafening. As the door clicked shut behind them, Damien shrugged off his jacket and turned to Brittany. "Are you planning to keep that thing on forever?" he asked, his voice sharp. Brittany calmly removed her gloves and placed them neatly on the dresser. "Until I'm ready," she replied evenly. Damien laughed bitterly. "Ready for what? To stop playing this game?" She faced him squarely, eyes visible through the veil. "This isn't a game. And I'm not hiding anything that should matter." "Maybe not to you," he snapped. "But I'm the one standing here while people wonder what's wrong with my wife." Do you even care? If their opinion weighs more than I do in your mind, Brittany said, then maybe you need to reconsider what this marriage means to you. Her words struck harder than he anticipated. Damien ran a hand through his hair, frustration tangled with shame. I just want to know the truth. Why won't you let me see you? When the time is right, she said softly. And who gets to decide that? I do. They stood in tense silence. Finally, Damien turned away and poured himself a drink. Fine, he muttered. Keep your secrets. Just don't expect me to wait around forever. Brittany didn't respond. She sat down at the vanity, removing her earrings with methodical calm. Her quiet refusal echoed louder than any argument. Damien downed the whiskey in one gulp. This wasn't the life he'd imagined. And yet, something deep inside told him this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The days following their tense wedding passed in a blur of polite distance and cold civility. Damien kept his interactions with Brittany to a minimum, often disappearing into his office or going for long drives through the misty outskirts of Seattle. Still, he couldn't help but notice the little things. The way she moved through the estate with purpose. The way staff seemed to respect her without question. The way she quietly left a mark on the household without drawing attention to herself. It was during one of those moments that Damien stumbled upon something unexpected. Late one morning, while reviewing a failing merger proposal in the sunlit study, he grew increasingly annoyed with the numbers. Nothing added up, and the entire deal seemed on the verge of collapse. Need a second pair of eyes? He turned, startled. Brittany stood in the doorway, a simple dress draped elegantly on her frame, her face still hidden beneath the ever-present veil. I didn't hear you come in, he said curtly. This isn't really your area. You might be surprised, she said calmly. Before he could object, she crossed the room and picked up one of the documents. The numbers aren't the issue, she said after a glance. It's the wording in this clause, it's too ambiguous. That's what's making the other party uneasy. Damien leaned in, scanning the section she indicated. You think that's the holdup? I don't think, I'm sure. Adjust the language to be more specific and they'll feel secure enough to sign. He eyed her, curious despite himself. How do you even know that? Brittany placed the document down neatly. Just because I didn't grow up in your boardroom doesn't mean I don't understand strategy. With that, she turned and left the study, leaving Damien staring after her, silently impressed. A few days later, Damien again found himself drawn into a moment he hadn't anticipated. He was cutting through the back garden on his way to the garage when he heard laughter coming from the kitchen window. Curious, he paused. Inside, Brittany stood near the counter, still veiled but visibly at ease as she spoke with the household staff. Her tone was light, her laughter easy. The kitchen buzzed with warmth. You've outdone yourself with the pastries today, Mrs. Hale, Brittany said, voice warm. They're almost too pretty to eat. Mrs. Hale beamed. You're too kind, Mrs. Carter. But you've got to try the lemon ones, they're my personal favorite. Brittany laughed, lifting a plate. Don't mind if I do. From the doorway, Damien watched silently. The woman behind the veil was not the cold mystery he had imagined. She was gracious, warm, even charming. And everyone in the room adored her. Later that week, over an unusually quiet dinner, Brittany surprised him again. How's the merger progressing? She asked casually, her voice calm but sincerely curious. Damien glanced up, caught off guard. It's slow. Even with the wording change, they're hesitating. She nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people need more than documents. Maybe invite them here, let them see who you are. People are more inclined to trust what they can witness firsthand. Damien blinked. You think that would help? It couldn't hurt, she said simply. He followed her suggestion. And to his quiet surprise, it worked. The deal went through and Damien was left wondering how he'd ever dismissed her in the first place. As the days turned into weeks, Damien began watching Brittany more closely. Not with suspicion, but with curiosity. He noticed the way she listened intently, spoke carefully, and handled every situation with quiet strength. Despite the veil, he was beginning to see her more clearly than ever before. The tension between Damien and Brittany had been building like a storm, thick, charged, and waiting for release. Despite brief moments of mutual understanding, the veil remained a symbol of distance between them. And one evening, as dusk settled over the estate, Damien decided he couldn't hold back anymore. He found her in the library where she often retreated to read. She was nestled in the corner by the window, bathed in the soft glow of a table lamp, a book resting open in her lap. The veil still concealed her face. Brittany, he began, his voice tighter than he intended. She looked up, her stormy gray eyes meeting his. Yes. We need to talk. She set the book aside. About what? Damien stepped forward, frustration bubbling up. Why do you keep hiding behind that veil? Do you think I can't handle whatever it is you're so afraid of showing? Brittany's gaze held steady, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, doubt or maybe pain. This isn't about you, Damien, she said quietly. Then what is it about? He pressed. Because from where I'm standing, it feels like a test. Like you're waiting to see how long I'll play along. Brittany stood slowly, her movements graceful but deliberate. She turned away, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not a test. Then why? Damien asked, taking a step closer. Do you think I won't accept you? That I'll see something I can't unsee? Her shoulders stiffened and for a long moment she didn't reply. Then she turned to face him fully. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm. Do you really want to know why? Yes, Damien said, his voice more sincere now. I wore the veil because I wanted to be seen for who I am, she said. Not for what I look like. Not for what people expect. I wanted to be evaluated for my thoughts, my choices, my strength, not my appearance. And I hoped you'd be someone who could look deeper. Her words landed with the weight of truth, hitting Damien harder than he'd anticipated. She went on, voice softening, but it seems you've been more focused on what's hidden than what's right in front of you. Damien's throat tightened. He had no response. I'm sorry, he murmured. Brittany's expression shifted, less guarded, more vulnerable. I'm not asking for an apology, she said gently. I'm asking for patience. And honesty. Damien nodded slowly. You're right. I was wrong to judge you for something I didn't understand. She gave him a faint, almost invisible smile. We all have blind spots. The question is whether we're willing to look past them. He took a slow breath. I want to try. To really see you, not just what's under the veil. Everything. Brittany studied him for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. Then let's start there. As she sat back down and picked up her book again, Damien didn't leave. He sat nearby in silence, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The following weeks brought a subtle but meaningful shift. Damien was more attentive, less reactive. He thought often about their conversation in the library, replaying her words. He knew if he wanted a real marriage, he needed to start treating her like a partner, not a mystery to be solved. One morning over breakfast, he spoke with intent. Brittany, he said, setting down his coffee. I've been thinking about what you said. About wanting to be seen. She looked up, her gaze steady. I want to include you in the business more, he continued. Your insight during the merger was invaluable. If you're open to it, I'd like your help with some upcoming projects. There was a long pause before she answered. I'd be glad to help. That afternoon, Brittany joined him in the Carter Enterprises boardroom for the first time. The executives were surprised, but no one dared question her presence. As the meeting began, she sat silently, listening, absorbing every word. When Damien turned to her for input, she responded without hesitation. The issue isn't just financial, she said. It's about perception. If we want long-term loyalty, we need to show mutual investment, not dominance. There was a silence in the room as her words settled in. Slowly, heads nodded in agreement. Afterward, walking back to his office, Damien glanced at her. You were brilliant in there. I just told the truth, she said simply. Sometimes, he replied, that's exactly what people need. As days passed, Damien sought her opinion more frequently. He began to admire not just her intelligence, but the grace with which she navigated complex situations. He noticed how she treated the staff with kindness. How she remembered small things, leaving tea on his desk during long nights, suggesting articles or books he might enjoy. In return, Damien made an effort to show his appreciation. He asked about her day. He invited her input. He started seeing her not just as a wife, but as someone he genuinely respected. One evening, as they sat in the garden under soft lantern lights, he finally asked something that had lingered on his mind. Why did you agree to marry me, Brittany? You didn't have to. Brittany gazed ahead at the swaying blooms. Because I saw potential in you, she said quietly. I saw someone capable of becoming more. Damien's throat tightened. And do you think I'm becoming that man? She looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet warmth. You're getting there. Though they had grown closer, the veil still remained, a quiet symbol of everything that hadn't yet been said. One night, seated by the fireplace after dinner, Damien turned to Brittany, his voice gentle. I don't want to pressure you. But do you think you'll ever take it off? Brittany didn't flinch. She looked at him calmly. When the time is right. He nodded, though disappointment tugged at him quietly. I just want you to know, he added, I'll be here when you are. For the first time, Brittany reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. Thank you, she said. That moment, simple, quiet, and genuine, shifted something between them. From then on, they functioned more like a team. Brittany attended business meetings, offered insights, and became a natural presence at Carter Enterprises. Damien introduced her formally at a leadership meeting. Before we begin, he said to the board, I want to acknowledge someone whose guidance has made a real difference in recent months. My wife, Brittany. She's not only helped shape this project, but continues to shape the future of this company. Brittany stood, composed but humble. Thank you. I look forward to working with all of you. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a force. In their private life, they found joy in the small things. Coffee in the sunroom, debates over articles, walks through the downtown art district. Brittany made Damien laugh more easily. Damien, in turn, learned to listen more, to slow down, to ask questions instead of assume. One evening during a quiet stroll through Pike Place Market, Damien looked over at her and smiled. Ever think about how far we've come? Brittany gave a soft laugh. Every day. Especially when I remember how furious you were the first time we met. Damien grinned. You drove me crazy. Still do. And yet, she teased, you've kept showing up. He pulled her gently closer. I'll keep showing up. The night of the Rainridge Unity Gala arrived with all the splendor of a royal celebration. Held in the grand ballroom of the Rains estate, the event honored the success of the merger and the future of both families' enterprises. Guests flooded the venue, power brokers, philanthropists, celebrities. The chandeliers glittered above them like stars. Damien moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the grand staircase, scanning for Brittany. She hadn't said much about how or if she planned to appear. Will your wife be joining us tonight? A curious investor asked. She'll be here, Damien replied, though even he wasn't entirely certain. Then the music softened. Conversations dulled. All eyes lifted toward the top of the staircase. And there she stood, Brittany. Her emerald gown shimmered like dew on leaves. Her posture was regal, her presence unmistakable. But what drew gasps wasn't the dress. It was the fact that, for the first time, her face was fully visible. She descended slowly, every movement graceful and deliberate. Her features, elegant cheekbones, clear skin, and those storm-gray eyes were striking, but what captivated everyone was the way she owned the moment. Damien's heart pounded as she reached the bottom step. She met his gaze and gave a quiet, steady smile. He crossed the ballroom toward her as the sea of guests instinctively parted. Brittany, he said softly. Why now? She turned to him, her voice calm but resolute. Because it was time. She faced the room, her tone carrying across the crowd with unexpected power. I know many of you wondered why I wore a veil for so long. Some of you assumed the worst. But the truth is simple, I wanted to be seen for my mind. For my choices. For my values. She paused. I didn't want to be judged by what I looked like or by what people expected of me. I wanted to build this marriage and my life on substance, not spectacle. Her words echoed through the silence. The room, full of people used to appearances, was captivated. Then she turned to Damien again. I wore the veil hoping someone would look beyond it. That he would look for me. His voice trembled as he stepped closer. I see you now, Brittany. I think I always did. I just didn't understand what I was looking at. The air seemed to still. I've fallen in love with your strength, your clarity, your kindness. With you, he said. Brittany's eyes shimmered, though her smile didn't waver. And I've fallen in love with the man who learned how to truly see. Damien reached for her hands. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Together, she agreed. The weeks following the Rainridge Unity Gala brought a quiet transformation neither Damien nor Brittany could have predicted. With the veil gone, it wasn't just her face that was fully revealed, it was her entire presence. Her voice carried with new confidence. Her laughter came more freely. Her warmth, once restrained, now filled every room she entered. For Damien, the change was just as profound. He no longer saw Brittany as a mystery or a responsibility. He saw her as his partner, someone who grounded him, challenged him, and made him better. Their mornings began with shared coffee in the breakfast nook, exchanging thoughts about the day ahead. Their evenings were spent discussing business strategies, charity events, or just quietly reading side by side. At Carter Enterprises, Brittany was no longer a surprise guest. She was a respected contributor. During one crucial strategy meeting, Damien stood at the head of the boardroom and addressed the room full of department heads and senior advisors. Before we begin, he said, his tone confident but warm, I'd like to recognize someone who's helped shape the direction of this company in more ways than most realize, my wife, Brittany. There was polite applause as Brittany stood and nodded modestly. I'm honored to be a part of this, she said. And I'm looking forward to what we'll build together. She was no longer simply Mrs. Carter. She was a strategist, a leader, and someone the entire team had come to admire. Outside the office, Damien and Brittany began traveling more, exploring cities, visiting nonprofit organizations, sponsoring creative projects, and speaking together at leadership forums. They had found their rhythm, not just in business, but in life. One night, during a stroll through a quiet street in Florence, Damien paused, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I never imagined this," he said when we stood at that altar. Brittany smiled gently. "Neither did I. But I think we both became something more than we expected." He took her hand. "And we did it together." The final scene played out back in Seattle, in the executive boardroom of Carter Enterprises. Damien and Brittany sat side by side at the head of the long conference table, a new initiative outlined in front of them, a project that would reshape the company's global vision. Damien leaned forward, addressing the room with calm authority. "Before we move forward," he said, "I want to acknowledge the person who's been my greatest collaborator through this process, my wife." He glanced at Brittany, his smile sincere. "Her insight and clarity have changed the way I lead. I couldn't ask for a better partner, in business or in life." Brittany returned the smile, steady and radiant. "Thank you, Damien. I feel the same. It's been an honor to build something meaningful with you." The boardroom filled with quiet nods of approval as the meeting continued. Later that evening, as the city glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Damien and Brittany stood on the balcony overlooking the skyline. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I never thought this is where we'd end up," he admitted. Brittany leaned into him, her eyes on the horizon. "We started with a contract," she said, "and ended with a choice." Damien smiled. "The best one I've ever made. And one we keep making," she added. "Every day." They stood in silence for a moment, wrapped in the comfort of what they'd built. Because what had begun as an arranged union had transformed into something far deeper, a partnership forged through patience, honesty, and the courage to grow together. And as the city pulsed beneath them, Damien knew this wasn't just a happy ending. It was the beginning of everything that mattered.